Good morning to my fellow West Coasters. Good afternoon to folks in other parts of the country. Thank you for joining us. My name is Nadine Gartner, and I am the Executive Director of Boost Oregon. For those of you who may not be familiar with Boost, I wanted to give just a brief intro. So next slide, please. Boost Oregon is a parent-led, independent, nonprofit organization that empowers people to make science-based vaccine decisions for themselves, their families, and the community. We envision a world where people's health decisions are rooted in science. In short, we aim for informed people and healthy communities. Our approach is through vaccine education, and we accomplish this through three prongs. First and foremost, educating people directly, which we do through workshops, materials printed as well as online, and video content. Second is supporting medical providers, training folks who deal with vaccine hesitant patients on how to effectively communicate with them. And third, encouraging peer advocates, where we work with community members of a specific community and train them on how to effectively converse about vaccines with their neighbors and friends. Ultimately, we don't tell people what to do. We listen and we provide evidence-based information. We want people to choose to vaccinate and to feel good about that decision. Next slide. So up until the COVID pandemic, our work was really focused on face-to-face conversations. We would have these community workshops where we spoke with new and expecting parents about their children's vaccines. And ways in which to get people away from their computer screens and away from the holes of vaccine misinformation and the fear mongering, and to really have a chance to talk one-on-one with a medical provider. Ultimately, with the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccines, we realized that we really needed to scale this education on a much larger basis. And so we knew that we wouldn't have the luxury of face-to-face conversations with every Oregonian. We wanted to figure out how can we reach the greatest number of folks in our state and educate them about COVID-19 vaccines. And so this is where we partnered with Lillian Labs and Dial Smith. And we asked them, how can we message effectively to Oregonians about the importance of COVID-19 vaccines? And we were really curious, is it a scientific or an emotional appeal that's more effective? With our other modes of communication, we really take both. We connect with people emotionally first and build trust, and then we present the science and the facts. And that's really effective in a face-to-face conversation, but it's difficult to accomplish that in a 30-second ad. So we wanted to learn from Lillian Labs, how can we best achieve this? And then the other real question we had was, should the message differ by race? You know, when we were looking into this originally back in December, when the vaccines were first becoming available, there was a lot of press about vaccine hesitancy among communities of color, particularly Black Americans. And so we wanted to know if we should be tailoring our messages for specific racial communities. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Gina Derrickson, my co-presenter. She is Vice President of Research and Consulting at Lillian Labs and a 20-year veteran of qualitative research, where she's worked to develop and refine product and sales messaging for companies like Amazon, Salesforce, Johnson & Johnson, and Procter & Gamble. Gina is going to be presenting the findings from a recently completed study on COVID-19 vaccine messaging that Lillian Labs conducted in partnership with Boost Oregon. Take it away, Gina.
Thanks, Nadine, and welcome everybody. Thanks for spending a part of your day with us today. So, a little bit about Lillian Labs. We're a boutique strategic messaging qualitative research firm. We have experience across multiple industries: healthcare, financial services, consumer goods, appliances, and more. We're not virus or vaccine experts, but we do know how to do research on messaging. So let me take you first through an overview of the message. As Nadine said, Lillian Labs partnered with our sister technology firm, Dialsmith, and Boost Oregon. And our online study had the goal of offering research based recommendations to optimize Boost Oregon's efforts in communicating accurate information about the COVID-19 vaccine to targeted populations that might be hesitant or resistant to taking the vaccine. So, what did we do? We fielded a national online survey in late January to early February with 200 adults. We specifically chose people that were aged 40 to 64 so that they would have a moderate risk of COVID and qualification for the vaccine. We broke our sample down to 50% Caucasian, 50% African American, so that we could see what was behind some of those initial hypotheses that we had about race and breakouts. And we also looked for those that had a low to moderate willingness to receive the vaccine when it became available to them. In addition to the online survey, we also dial tested 2 audio recordings that offered distinct approaches to providing information about the COVID-19 vaccine and why people should think about getting it. Additionally, we conducted follow up in depth interviews with 6 of the African American survey respondents because we wanted to dig deeper into those thoughts that were driving their hesitancy. So we looked at the data broken out in 2 ways. First was the willingness to take the COVID-19 vaccine. We broke people into opposition or persuadables. And then we also looked at the data broken out by ethnicity or race. So let's first focus on who are the persuadables and the opposition. And we determined that by one key question, and that was, how likely are you to receive the COVID-19 vaccine when it is available to you? On a 0 to 10 scale, those people that responded 8, 9, or 10 had a high likelihood to get vaccinated. We called them the on board segment, and we did not include them in our survey. We thought they're going to get it. There's no reason to cater specific messages to them. Within our study participants, though, those that responded with the 4, 5, 6, or 7 on that 0 to 10 scale had a moderate likelihood to get vaccinated. We called them the persuadables. Those were the people that we felt like we could reach with effective messaging. On the low end of the scale, those who responded 0, 1, 2, or 3, we called the opposition. And actually, even though they could have responded with a 0 to 3, the average score was a 0.9. So a lot of zeros and ones in that willingness. And they're the opposition, but we're going to learn more about them as well. So, of note, waiting is another indication of hesitancy. And in the opposition group, actually 86% of those people said that they would wait at least a year after the vaccine was available to them to get it. So that's a really long hurdle of people waiting a year for a vaccine to address a pandemic that we're currently in. So they are really, really opposed. How has each group responded to COVID-19? The persuadables tend to be more concerned about getting COVID. They score an average of 6.5 on a 10-point concern scale versus opposition on a 4.5 scale. And persuadables have also been more compliant with practicing safe measures. We asked about a variety of different precautions they've taken in different situations. And one example here is that 31% of the opposition say they never wear a mask in the presence of close friends and family that are outside of their immediate family. If you think you might know some people that would fall into the opposition group, they say things like this: it's a free country and peer pressure is unacceptable. Or, I believe some of the information is overplayed to scare people. So, who are they politically? Persuadables skew more liberal, while the opposition skews more conservative. And who do they trust? For this question, we gave them 12 different information sources related to COVID-19, and we asked them to rank those sources from 1 to 12. Looking at the top 4 for each group, they both had their personal and local healthcare providers in the top 4. Persuadables rounded out their top 4 with CDC officials and global public health officials, whereas opposition rounded out their top 4 with close friends and family and nonprofit organizations. And I believe CDC officials were number 6 or number 7 on their list, so quite a bit different. One person in the opposition even said, there will be fatal side effects that will be covered up by the pharmaceutical companies that made these vaccines. Persuadables tend to be more aligned with preventive medicine. Here we see that even 18% of the opposition disagrees with the statement that all children should be vaccinated against common childhood diseases. One opposition supported that with the statement, I don't trust vaccines. 2 of my grandsons have autism due to vaccines. And we see that 1/3 of opposition disagree that they regularly schedule visits with the healthcare provider for annual checkups. And one supporting statement was, I've never had a flu shot and I'm not about to start getting one now. Just a little bit of a different perspective there on preventive medicine. So now let's look at how do each of these segments respond to messaging. I want to direct your attention to the bottom of the screen where you see a gray box with a black figure in it. That's when we online dial test messages. Each respondent has a slider. It's what we call it on their screen. It's a 0 to 100 scale. And in this case, 0 meant that they disliked what they were hearing, and 100 meant that they really liked what they were hearing. And as they heard each message that we tested, they moved the red slider button either to the right or the left to indicate how much they liked what they heard. And in the background, what we're doing is we are collecting data every second from each respondent to see how well they like what they're hearing in that moment. And then we can average them and look at results as a group to kind of analyze and break down the message and see things that are effective and not effective. Let's talk about the 2 messages that we tested. One we called the science approach, and this one went into the medical and the technical details of how the vaccine was developed, how it was approved, how many people were in the clinical, and what types of people were in the clinical, addressing a lot of questions that people have, that are medical and technical. Compare that to what we called the loving approach, which was a bit more gentle, and it really talked more about the community's moral obligation to receive the vaccine to help other people who may be more vulnerable and that need it. So let's hear a clip of each of these approaches just to get a feel for what they sounded like.
This vaccine technology has been around for several years now. Because COVID-19 is similar to the SARS and MERS viruses, much of the research and clinical trials performed on SARS and MERS vaccines could be reapplied to COVID-19.
So that was the science approach. Now let's hear the loving approach.
Our elders are one group at a significantly higher risk for dying from COVID-19 and complications. These are the people who helped create the economy that we all prosper from. They are parents, grandparents, and special friends to people who care about them so much.
So we get a lot of information when we dial test messages, and I just want to briefly go through a little bit of what we capture and what we analyze. So here on the screen, you see on the horizontal axis is time in seconds, and on the vertical axis is the average 0 to 100 scale. And we chart the moment-to-moment results each second on here so that you can compare this to the transcript and you can analyze what was being said and what people's reactions were at that moment. So just two brief points I'd like to point out here for the science approach. We look at persuadables in that teal blue and opposition in the yellow green. And so for the opposition, shortly into the video, that first red circle shows a dip. And that's the first time we mentioned the vaccine. So it's almost like all we need to do is say that V word and they like it less. So they're having a reaction just to anybody talking to them about the vaccine. To the far right of the chart, we see another circled area, and this is for the persuadables. And towards the end of the message, we had a quote from Dr. Fauci, and he said, "We do know that the vaccine is safe and can prevent symptomatic COVID-19 and severe disease." And you see the persuadables, they've been pretty optimistic and favorable about the message the whole time. And that quote from Dr. Fauci just gives them an even higher lift. So that was even particularly impactful for them. Here's what the persuadables said about the science approach. "It seems to address the fears of many who are a little hesitant to take the vaccine, like myself." Or, "It was detailed and informative without being condescending." So let's now look at the loving approach message, what worked and didn't work. Again, you see a pretty significant difference between persuadables and oppositions and how they chart. But I can say for the opposition, the red circle on the left shows an uptick for them. And that's when we said, even beyond the health impacts, others are suffering ill effects in terms of financial health and mental wellness. So it looks like that might be a part of the conversation where we get some pull from the opposition. That might be a starting point for a conversation there. Let's not just talk about health, let's talk about finances and mental wellness. And then on the right side of your chart, you see there's a quote from Dr. Frederick, who is the president of Howard University, a historically Black college, and he's also a surgeon. And he also has sickle cell disease, and he was one of the first to receive the vaccine. And he talked about, "However, we can't get to the other side of this pandemic without you." And actually, for both of the groups, that resonated well for them. So, what did Persuadables say about the loving approach? It reminds us that we're all in this together. A man with sickle cell was one of the first to get the vaccine. He was leading by example. So let's summarize what we learned a bit. Here's what you need to know about persuadables. Why they say they'll wait. They say things like, there's not enough facts and information on the effectiveness or the side effects. They want to wait and see how it affects others. They're waiting until people who are older or with health problems get it first. Or they say they'll get it when their physician says I should because I have a pre-existing condition. But the good news is both of our messaging approaches were effective with this persuadables group. They all started out in the 4, 5, 6, 7 range of willingness to take the vaccine. When we tested that same measure after they saw the messages, 42% of them had actually moved into the 8, 9, or 10 range, that on-board range of people that were confident are ready to get vaccinated. Here's what you need to know about the opposition. Their opposition is strong. First, you need to convince them of the threat of COVID-19, move them to a compliance mindset, get them on board with vaccines in general, build a connection with a trusted source, and then you can start messaging about COVID-19 vaccines. So don't want to underestimate that groundwork that needs to be done with the opposition group. So let's look at the second thing that we wanted to understand better, and that is, how does race impact likelihood to take the vaccine? This was back in December when we started thinking about this. So we had the hypothesis that there would be an African American skew towards being hesitant or resistant. And actually, we discovered that African Americans skewed a bit more persuadable than Caucasian. Otherwise, differences were minimal between the two groups. Let's look at a few of those. African Americans were slightly more concerned about getting COVID-19 than Caucasians. That was mostly tied to a higher percentage of personal connection to someone impacted by COVID-19. For example, here we see 64% of African Americans personally knew someone who had been diagnosed with COVID-19 versus 50% of Caucasians. And that same relationship holds true for knowing someone who had been hospitalized by COVID-19. So let's briefly look at how these two groups responded to the messages. And on the screen, I have the persuadables and the opposition just as a reminder of how wide those gaps were for the loving approach. And now let's overlay Caucasian and African American breakouts. And you can see that they're much closer together. And also kind of the shapes of the lines, the dips and the peaks are very similar too. So the differences between these two groups are a bit more nuanced. And then just as a check, let's look at the science approach as well. You also see that those two lines are very close to each other. So just not as big of a difference as we thought. So let's summarize what you need to know about African Americans. They have a more personal connection to COVID-19. They're slightly more concerned about getting the virus and have been slightly more compliant with precautions. They also skew slightly more to persuadables, and they gave both messages a slightly higher rating than their Caucasian counterparts. So just as we had planned, I conducted 6 in-depth interviews with survey respondents that were African American to further understand kind of those thoughts, values, perceptions that drove their either willingness or hesitancy to get vaccinated. And I want to share 4 takeaways with you. First, they have a lot of questions about the vaccine. How is it developed? How is it tested? Who is in the clinical trial? What are the side effects? And really, all of those questions stem to, will it work for me? And what will my experience be if I get vaccinated? Second, they seek reassurance from 2 types of sources. First is the scientific and the medical community. They want to hear from the people that have developed and tested the vaccine. But just as important, they want to hear from people that they personally know that have taken the vaccine already, and not just after they take the vaccine, but a few weeks after they take the vaccine. They want to know they're okay. So they want to see people that look like themselves, people they see in the store, on their street, in their church, people that they can relate to, and they want to know that they're okay. Number 3, some feel they can control their prevention of contracting COVID-19 actually better than they can control the possibility of getting serious side effects from the vaccine. So it's a tricky and interesting situation here. You know, some of the people talked about, we've been isolating ourselves, we've been social distancing, washing our hands, wearing masks, and they've been doing everything right, and they haven't gotten COVID yet. And for them, it just felt a little counterintuitive to, but now I'm going to take this vaccine where I know I can get side effects. And, you know, why would I do that if I've been practicing preventing COVID-19 so carefully? And finally, I only talked to 6 people in depth, but they were all flu shot avoiders for multiple reasons. But they all tended to sense that flu shots were safer than the COVID-19 vaccine. So I think there's something there to be dug into a bit deeper. From this research, I want to identify 4 opportunities that I recommend for breakthrough messages. And even though this is mostly geared towards that African American segment that I did the in-depth interviews with, I think this probably applies to a larger population as well. So first, I would recommend framing the vaccine as a way to stay in control as compared to COVID that they can't control. Next, I would compare the uncertainty of long-term COVID symptoms to the long-term side effects of the vaccine. And as we progress with vaccines being administered, I think now we're 4 times as many people have received the vaccine compared to those number that have actually had COVID. So I think you can start making that case that we actually have more human data on vaccine and those side effects than COVID and its side effects. And I think we should be talking about that a lot to give more confidence in the vaccine. Number 3 is bringing to life the diversity of people in the clinical trials. Help them see themselves in the trial. Some of them will revert to Murphy's Law of, I probably wasn't represented in the clinical. If there's a weird side effect, I'm surely going to be the one to have it. They need to know that they were represented well. And lastly, is sharing stories of people weeks after their final vaccine to highlight their positive outlook. Not just that they're doing well physically and health-wise because of no serious side effects from the vaccine, but also emotionally where they are now, how they're more comfortable being around people, they're hugging their grandchildren, they're able to do things that they weren't and they're feeling better. So those are all important. I'm going to shift over to Nadine now so she can share how they put some of these insights into work in ads that they created.
Thank you, Gina. So we wanted to share with you 2 of the PSAs that we've produced using the results from Gina's study. And I think you'll hear in the copy of it, like with the messages that Gina talked about, and pick up on some of, you'll see the work in action. I want to point out these are 2 that we've done so far for whiter, more rural communities. One specific to the coastal communities where fishing is a major industry, and one toward more central and eastern Oregon. We also have PSAs that are targeted for Native Americans, Latinos, and African Americans, and those will be on our Vimeo page. So let's watch the rural one first.
I've worked hard my whole life, and I've relied on myself to get things done. So when the COVID-19 vaccines came out, I talked to my doctor and I made my own conclusions. I remember the effect that vaccines had on polio, smallpox, and the measles, not only in the nation but throughout the world. We need to get vaccinated. Let's cross the finish line together.
And now the fisherwoman.
One of the first things that got shut down for me was fishing, and fishing is so deeply entangled in my life, it just seemed unimaginable. So when we think about all of the things that fishing communities have faced, even in the last decade, we know that we do the best when we pull together and take care of one another. That's why we need to get vaccinated for ourselves, our families, and our community. Let's cross the finish line together.
Thanks. And now I want to share some other ways that the data and information that Gina presented has influenced our programming. We have a peer advocacy program where we train and support advocates who are not medical providers, but rather leaders and members of various communities across the state who want to speak about vaccines and improve vaccine confidence among their friends and families and neighbors. So we have a program that was really targeting African-American, the Latinx communities, and Native American communities. But coming from Gina's information, which again, we received these results back in January, February, I believe. And again, at that time, people were not talking about in the media or in the press the hesitancy that was happening among largely rural white communities. And so this information was news to us, and it made us realize that we really need to expand our focus and not just concentrate on communities of color, but also white rural communities. And so our peer advocacy program now has a segment devoted to rural, white, also Christian. And we're really working with church members and leaders and folks who are from local ranching and farming communities so that they can instill confidence about the vaccines within their own neighborhoods. And finally, we continue to do our face-to-face education, although it's all virtual now. But we've been doing dozens of COVID-19 vaccine workshops on an as-requested basis by employers, schools, community organizations. It's been really impactful and really effective. But the information that we received from Gina was really useful in crafting the content for those presentations. And so we really focus on how the vaccines were developed and monitored for safety. We talk about the demographics of the trials so that people know that folks like them were part of the trials, and that the vaccines were not only tested on certain segments of the population. And then we talk about side effects, which seems to be a big concern for folks. And in presenting that information, we've had incredible feedback from folks that it makes them feel much more confident and comfortable about taking the vaccine and ultimately choosing to do so. So with that, we are happy to answer any questions. The slides to this presentation are available if you're interested. If you look in the chat, you can send an email to Lillian Labs to get a copy of the slides. And I think now I'll look into the Q&A and see what questions have been asked. Starting at the top, since healthcare providers have the trust of all groups, how do we also educate them about how to message to increase adoption of the COVID vaccine? Great question. This is something Boost Oregon has been doing since our inception, educating providers on having effective conversations with their patients. And now that we're moving to another phase of immunization, where we're moving away from the mass vaccine sites, and vaccine will be more and more accessible and available at healthcare providers' offices, we want to encourage providers to have these conversations with their patients. We offer all sorts of trainings and materials specific to that. You can look at our website for our COVID-19 page. But ultimately, we want providers to take every opportunity there is to bring it up. If someone is in your office because they have a broken toe and you notice that they have not received a COVID vaccine, let's make sure that you use that opportunity to have the conversation and to really treat it with a presumptuous approach that you're assuming that they will get it. Oh, I see you didn't get your COVID vaccine. Well, let's take care of that today. Do you have any questions about it? Therefore, you're leaving open the possibility of conversation and to be able to answer any concerns they may have, but you're really treating it as part of routine care and as something that you recommend. Gina, this question looks to you. To what degree do you think your loving approach message is actually a guilt appeal?
Yeah, that is a really interesting question. So, some could sense that it's a guilt appeal. I mean, it's hard because it's really more about a community, gathering together, right? And taking care of the people that you live near and around and that you care about. So I guess that's the positive spin. But if you want to go to the flip side, kind of the negative approach to it is like, well, if you're not doing that, are we saying that you're a bad person, or, you should be guilty if you're not? It could be seen as that way. Nothing that we did tested that idea, but I could totally see where that could be a consideration.
And I would just add, we know that shame does not work in changing people's minds, and that's, we don't want people to make a decision out of shame or guilt. So if you see the emotional appeal as a guilt appeal, that's not the intention, and that's not what I would recommend others do. So this is for Gina as well. So there's hesitancy in both conservative white communities and communities of color. How were their concerns different?
You know, I don't know that their concerns really were so different. We suspected, just because of some of the historical lessons that we've learned in the U.S., that people of color would have different reasons and, you know, different stories, different memories that would kind of taint their ability to trust healthcare professionals. But we really didn't see that come out in the study much at all. So they were very similar with regards to their perceptions about COVID-19 and the vaccine.
Does your new outreach plan also focus on Native American communities? Absolutely. We have a 60-second PSA that will be posted on our Vimeo site later this week. We're just fixing some of the sound editing on it. But we're really excited to debut that. We have our peer advocacy program where we're working with Native American community members to talk about vaccines with their friends and family. And we also are collaborating with Indian Health Services to serve the 9 federally recognized tribes in Oregon with various materials and trainings to make sure that we are doing as much outreach as we can. Next, it looks like very interesting study and conclusions that lines up with how survey data that looks at how media literacy and trust in experts impacts perceptions of COVID-19, collected by Murrow College faculty. Do you have any data, perhaps open-ended comments, that reflect the role of emotional processes and medical science in perceptions of risk from COVID-19?
That is also a great question and quite the loaded question. I know who asked this, so we do have open ends from the survey, and I'd be happy to share those and have that conversation and dig into that as well.
Great. Do you think these results are representable to populations outside Oregon? How would you recommend implementing this in other areas of the country?
Actually, the results were a national sample. So even though our focus on implementing them in Nadine's work was focused in Oregon, it's national data. You know, it's not the largest sample because it was pro bono work, but you know, I think based on other research that I've seen, it seems to be consistent with a lot of other studies.
How were the study participants enrolled?
So it was an online survey using panel providers that we typically use in market research. We had some screening questions that we qualified them regarding their age and things like that. And then, you know, the big question was their willingness to take the vaccine.
Who presents at your workshops? So Boost Oregon, our workshops are all led by volunteer medical providers who train specifically with us in hosting these workshops and providing education in ways that are positive and don't use fear or you know, just really positive motivational interviewing type of techniques. So they're all medical providers and a range of medical doctors, physician's assistants, nurses, naturopathic providers. So those are the folks who lead our workshops. Out of curiosity, did any of your open-ended data indicate emotional responses to the messages?
I will say yes. And, you know, with any online survey you do, some of the open-ended data, some of them are, you know, a few words of a response, and sometimes you get sentences or multiple sentences. And I can say there was plenty of emotion in some of those full sentences. And again, I'd be happy to share that information.
And then last question, did you consider socioeconomic status and response to the vaccine?
We did not include socioeconomic status, just because we kind of fine-tuned our survey a bit. And I'm not sure what the question means as far as response to the vaccine. We did consider their interest, and no one who took the survey had received the vaccine yet. And again, that was, late January, early February, so it wasn't as widespread available as it is now.
Thanks, Gina. I don't see anything else in the Q&A. Maybe we'll give a moment if anyone has any last minute questions.
Or also feel free to reach out to either one of us if you want to have a conversation, if you have questions. I think we've been chatting out links with emails, or if you also want a copy of the presentation, we're happy to share.
Yeah, absolutely. And if Boost Oregon can assist anyone in training your staff or provider networks about having these conversations with patients, or hosting workshops for your constituents, in this virtual world, we can reach well beyond Oregon's borders. So we're here to help. Any plans to repeat this now the vaccine has been available for a while? Curious if sentiments have changed at all.
We currently don't have plans to repeat it. I'm sure sentiments have changed, just, as far as I think it would be more difficult to get that persuadable group, because they've probably been more on board now, because I've seen a lot of work. I mean, I'm in Ohio as well, but I've seen a lot of work here that kind of reflects those messages that we tested, and I'm glad, because I think it's been effective. So I'm sure things are different now, but no immediate plans to repeat the research.
Great. Well, having not seen any other questions, I guess we can wrap up. As Gina mentioned, please feel free to contact either of us if there's anything that we can assist with. Thank you so much for joining us today. Gina, thank you for all your work. It really, obviously you saw how it's made an impact on the work that we do, and expanded our programming and reaching populations that we weren't thinking about early on. So really appreciate everything that you've done for us, and for helping our state return to, some sort of pre-pandemic life. So thank you.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure working with you. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.